Welcome. This is a sleep story, a gentle journey through a quiet world meant to help you relax, slow down, and drift softly into sleep. There is no urgency here, no tension, no destination that must be reached. You are invited to let go of the day. Find a comfortable position. Rest your head. Let your breath move slowly in and out without effort. Feel the air where it touches your skin. Allow your body to grow heavy. With each word, allow yourself to settle. If your mind drifts, that's perfectly fine. There is nothing you need to remember. Simply let the story carry you, like a current beneath calm waters. And now, let us begin. This story takes place on the water world of Abbai 4, home to the Abbai people, an ancient and graceful species from the League of Non-Aligned Worlds within the Babylon 5 universe. The Abbai are a matriarchal, pacifist civilization who dwell beneath the surface of their vast oceans, within bioharmonic cities shaped to blend with the sea. Their lives are deeply attuned to rhythm, to breath, to the quiet persistence of time. The city of Naraan'ta is one such place. Suspended beneath filtered dome light and gentle currents, it is a sanctuary of stillness and balance. In this story, you will follow Tiyanna, an ocean gardener and quiet teacher. Her life is marked not by events, but by presence, by the tending of living things, the sharing of breath and verse, and the long, slow unfolding of a single peaceful day. There is no danger here, no war, no rush, only the steady movement of water, the soft pulse of a sleeping reef, and the stillness, waiting for you beneath the tide. The Still Waters of Naraan'ta, an Abbai sleep story. Part 1. Morning Drift. Tiyanna stirred before the first glow of dawn. Her breathing, deep and slow, matched the gentle rhythm of the tide whispering against the substructure of her home. The water outside her dwelling pulsed with a sleepy blue hue, filtered through the bioglass of the dome overhead. Above it all, faint ripples of current danced like distant thoughts across the ceiling. She did not rush. No Abbai ever did. Tiyanna unfolded from her sleeping mat, woven from kelp fiber strands hand-dyed in coral and sea stone. She sat for a time, cross-legged, her hands resting palms up on her knees. Her eyes closed again, not in sleep, but in stillness. Around her, the quiet hum of her home's thermal regulators offered a soft undertone, like the breath of the sea herself. A minute passed, then 2. She gently pressed her fingertips together in a gesture of thanks, to the ocean, to the ancestors, to the simple gift of another day. From a shallow alcove to her left, she withdrew her robe. It was long and finely layered, in tones of violet and mineral green, fastened by a single clasp in the shape of a reef pearl. The fabric flowed as she moved, whispering faintly against the smooth ceramic floors. She passed beneath an archway that adjusted its hue to her touch, fading from soft teal to gentle amber as she stepped through. Her kitchen was already awake. A subtle change in ambient temperature, the blooming scent of morning herbs steeping in a carved shell bowl, and a faint trickle of melodic wind tones coming through the coral lattice vents welcomed her. Breakfast was always ritual. She unsealed a ceramic pod of slow-fermented tide fruit paste and spread it delicately on flat rounds of grain leaf bread. Beside them, she placed steamed root threads, curled into little spirals like sea snail shells, and sprinkled them with sun-dried mineral salt from the shallows near the western ridge. Her tea, drawn from a living vine that curled along the wall behind her prep station, released notes of citrus and iodine as it steeped. She ate slowly, facing east. There were no clocks in the traditional sense here. The light patterns on the dome gradually shifted from moon glow to dawn shine, signaling the start of her tending hours. Tiyanna's garden lay below the city, in a shallow crescent of cultivated seabed, reachable by an old spiral staircase carved from polished coral stone. Her sandals clicked softly as she descended. The walls of the stairwell bore inlaid etchings, swirling, meditative motifs retelling the histories of ancient Abbai sea paths and matriarchal lineages. She traced them lightly with her fingertips as she passed. At the final step, the world opened. Her garden stretched in neat terraced rows, gently swaying in the ocean current. She activated the dome's filtration grid with a light gesture, allowing a slow infusion of fresh current and nutrients to drift into the space. Above her, fish like brushed metal threads glided lazily, unbothered by the quiet visitor in their realm. One by one, Tiyanna began her rounds. Each plant had a name, passed down from her mentor, and each row bore significance. She moved among them with reverence. Whisper leaf with its translucent veins, moon pods clustered in delicate trios like thoughts too shy to form, and the elder root fans, whose tendrils curled protectively around younger shoots. She tended them silently, adjusting nutrient flow, removing pale or fraying growth, noting subtle shifts in their bioluminescence. Her hands moved with the certainty of memory, and her thoughts drifted like kelp in the tide, unhurried, content. After a time, she paused beside a pool where smaller creatures lived in symbiosis with the root clusters. She fed them slow-release nutrient spheres, shaped like tiny blue pearls, and watched as they emerged. Gentle, eyeless things with ribboned fins and translucent skin. She spoke aloud then, just once, her voice low and warm. "You are well today. May you remain so." It was an old greeting, used only for those who did not speak back. Part 2. The Still Hours. With her morning tending complete, Tiyanna stood in stillness beneath the domed garden ceiling. A shaft of soft, amber-tinted light filtered down through the filtered canopy, refracting into wavering gold patterns that danced on her robe and the glistening surfaces of the kelp beds. She did not need to look at a schedule or a chronometer. Her breath told her the time, lengthening slightly, a subtle change that all Abbai knew from birth. It was time for the Sattvala, the still hour when the city paused to harmonize. The journey to the communal chamber was brief, a gliding walk along a bio-carved corridor that ran the arc of the dome's upper ring. Small hexagonal tiles clicked gently beneath her sandals, their tones changing with each footfall in a soft musical scale. A pattern created to encourage a sense of progress and mindfulness. She passed others along the way, Abbai women of all ages, and a few graceful men, each nodding in silent greeting. No one hurried. One elder held a flowering shell vessel, its inner lining aglow with soft green spores. A pair of youths in translucent garments carried a ritual orb between them, swaying gently to the rhythm of their breath. Their serenity calmed her further. The chamber itself was shaped like a nautilus shell turned inward, the acoustics designed to enhance breath, silence, and the subtle sound of water. At its center floated the Kala Than, a suspended platform of living coral, gently pulsating with the heartbeat of the chamber. Tiyanna knelt at her usual station, a place marked by a silver thread embedded in the floor, shaped like a cresting wave. All around her, others did the same, forming a loose spiral of bodies, calm and synchronized. The Sattvala began not with sound, but with breath. Inhale, deep and slow. Hold. Exhale with reverence. Again. The practice lasted 12 full cycles of the chamber's ambient light pulse, long enough for minds to quiet, thoughts to settle, and internal tides to calm. No one spoke. The quiet was not oppressive, but shared, like floating together in a tranquil current. Afterward, no formal dismissal was needed. One by one, they rose and made their way out through separate channels, refreshed but unshaken. Outside the chamber, the city resumed its low, pulsing rhythm of life. Calm, slow, continuous. Tiyanna made her way to the western ring, where a small alcove stood nestled between a choral reading hall and the conservatory pools. Inside was the home of Salasha, a longtime friend and apprentice archivist. The air smelled of crushed sea-grain parchment and salt resin. Salasha greeted her with a low nod, then a quiet phrase. "May the quiet walk beside you." "And lift you gently," Tiyanna replied, completing the traditional response. They sat upon reclining mats of sponge cloth and mineral fiber, sharing a platter of spiced root curls and slow-churned algae butter. The food was secondary. This was a time for gentle conversation, of dreams, of memories, of things seen in the tides and shifts in plant patterns. No topics of urgency or tension were permitted during the midday calm. It was a social law and an emotional balm. Tiyanna spoke of a new coloration she had seen in the whisper-leaf beds, a pale silver blush not recorded in her garden logs. Salasha shared a dream of a sky filled with woven fish and the faint scent of dust, an unusual thing in a water world, and therefore curious. They exchanged a few small crafted items, Salasha offering a prism shell etched with verse, Tiyanna gifting a single bloom of tide glass coral, grown and shaped by hand. The exchange required no words. Gifts were accepted as tokens of presence, not value. Time passed gently. The slow shift of the dome's upper filters signaled the beginning of the light turn, when afternoon activities began. Tiyanna stood, bowed slightly, and left with a slow gesture of gratitude. Part 3. Echoes and Ink. The afternoon in Naraan'ta was a time of long shadows and softened light, filtered through many layers of kelp-stretched canopy and coral lattice. As the solar angle shifted, the ocean's hue deepened from tranquil green to dusky blue, and the city below responded in kind. Walls took on warmer tones. Floor tiles cooled beneath bare feet. Even the bioluminescent signage dimmed, as though whispering rather than calling. Tiyanna walked to the archive hall, a dome nested halfway up the reef shelf, flanked by ribbon trees and spiraled vents that sang when the current passed just so. The entrance had no doors, only layered curtains of soft fibers woven with symbols of memory. Flowing lines, broken curves, spirals nested within spirals. Inside, the air was faintly dry by Abbai standards, a necessary accommodation for the preservation of scrolls, carvings, and living inks. She moved with care across the cushioned floor, nodding to the statue of Ashari Dal, one of the great storytellers of the southern kelp plains. The statue held a stylus in one hand and a listening shell in the other, reminding all who entered that writing must begin with deep listening. At her workstation, the light pads were already warm. her tools lay ready: stylus stones in 3 widths, a cup of awakening scent to stir alertness, and a row of blank impression shells prepared for today's lessons. The ink she'd prepared earlier, harvested from the stilled glands of the nocturne squid, had reached full scent maturity, its blue-black surface rippling faintly like calm water before a storm. A chime sounded, soft and pleasant, as her apprentice arrived. Kelsari, no more than 17 solar cycles, entered with cautious steps. Her robe was a bit too formal, stiff with ceremonial folds, but her face bore the quiet eagerness of someone who adored knowledge more than comfort. "May the record greet you," she said in the traditional manner. "And flow through you," Tiyanna replied, motioning for her to sit. Today's lesson was not transcription, it was intonation. Abbai scripts, though beautiful on the page, were designed to be read aloud. Each curve, each rise and stroke, carried not only meaning but sound. A sentence was more than syntax, it was a tide, and to read it poorly was to disturb its current. Tiyanna handed Kelsari a shell etched with a verse from the Songs of Anael, one of the earliest known meditations recorded by pre-Dome Abbai philosophers. "Begin slowly," she said, settling beside her. Kelsari read, her voice soft, slightly uneven, but not without heart. "As stillness drinks the waves, so shall our hearts drink stillness. As the sun gives freely, we give and are not lessened." Tiyanna closed her eyes, letting the rhythm pass over her. The verse was one she had heard 100 times, but, like the waves, no 2 readings were ever quite the same. This one had the unsteadiness of youth, but also the sincerity of a mind trying to meet the text halfway. They worked together for a long while, reading, repeating, discussing the shape of meaning. Kelsari's fingers stained with ink as she traced the symbols, her breath growing steadier, more deliberate. There was no rush. Nothing, in fact, that needed to be achieved beyond presence and attention. As the light dimmed further and the chamber's ambient tone softened to evening hue, Tiyanna offered Kelsari a cup of cooled reef tea, signaling the end of the lesson. The apprentice bowed deeply, both hands pressed together in thanks, and departed with her shell tucked carefully into a wrap of protective cloth. Tiyanna remained for a while longer, recording a brief note in the training ledger, not for performance, but for continuity. Each student was like a current within the larger sea of culture, and her role was to track the flow, gently guiding it, never forcing it. She set down her stylus and listened. Outside, the faint cries of windfish echoed through the reef vents. Inside, the whispering air danced through scroll racks and chambered driftwood shelves. It was nearly evening, the time of preparation and quiet anticipation. She stood, stretched slowly, and made her way to the hall's outer gallery, a place where memory and tide met in long, low corridors of stone and silence. Part 4. Evening Currents. By the time Tiyanna emerged from the archive gallery, the light above the dome had mellowed into deep aquamarine, touched with slivers of gold. The reef sky shimmered faintly as the city's upper filtration towers rotated to soften the last light of the sun. It was not yet dark, but it was no longer day. She walked home by the long path. This route wound gently around the central axis of Naraan'ta, through shallow gardens and scent walks, long avenues lined with low-blooming tide brush, whose fragrance changed with temperature and light. The scent this evening was earthy, faintly mineral, with a cool finish like crushed stone. Few others were about. A young couple, their robes flowing like ink in the water, sat on a stone bench whispering soft phrases to one another. An elder Abbai in meditation robes scattered thin salt crystals into a reflecting pool, each grain releasing a tiny bubble as it touched the surface. Tiyanna greeted no one aloud, but she nodded once in passing, a slow, respectful tilt of the head. The return to solitude was not abrupt, but gradual, like slipping beneath warm water. Her dwelling welcomed her without a word. As she entered, the ambient lighting adjusted to a soft plum hue, and the soft tones of home resumed. The faint lilt of wind tone through the kelp chimes by her window, the deep hum of the dwelling's thermal anchors shifting into rest mode, the subtle drip of moisture from the dehumidifiers, collecting in an old hand-shaped bowl she had crafted as a child. She disrobed slowly, folding her outer robe along its traditional creases and placing it upon the sand-glass perch to air. Beneath it, her inner garments, simple woven strands, pale green with threads of opal, clung lightly to her skin. She crossed the room to the cleansing alcove, where stone, water, and heat converged in calming ritual. Bathing was not simply functional. It began with a moment of stillness. Tiyanna stepped into the shallow pool and sank to her knees. Warm brine, enriched with mineral salts and the scent of dune blossom, lapped gently against her shoulders. A fine mist drifted upward from tiny steam vents, enveloping her in quiet warmth. She remained unmoving for 3 full breath cycles, then reached for a sponge of dried bloom kelp, gently wiping her hands, arms, neck, and the backs of her ears in slow, circular motions. Each touch was deliberate, a cleansing not just of skin but of memory, rinsing away the small frictions of the day, clearing the mind for rest. She recited a quiet verse as she rinsed, "With salt I release. With warmth I yield. With water I return." When she emerged, the world felt softer. A short robe of pale sand color awaited her, lined with sea flax threads. She draped it over her shoulders, fastened it loosely with a clasp made from drift pearl, and padded barefoot into the kitchen area. Her evening meal would be modest: root broth steeped with spiral shell herbs, a side of sea corn, roasted until just crisped at the edges, and a small slab of dried moon fruit to finish. She moved slowly, reverently, preparing each item as if composing a song. The cooking flame shimmered blue under the ceramic kettle. The scent of broth began to wind its way through the home, delicate and grounding. As the food warmed, she set her small evening table, carved from aged stonewood, polished smooth by generations of hands. A single candle globe floated gently above the center, casting moving rings of light across the table's surface. She placed her bowl with care, setting the spoon to the left, as tradition dictated for the evening meal. Water was served in a small, ripple-cut glass, harvested from cooled volcanic sediment near the northern rift. She did not eat quickly. Each bite was a note, each sip a chord. Between them, silence. The silence was the music. When her meal was done, she cleared the table, rinsed the dishes in the flow basin, and returned them to their shelf. There was no clutter in her home, only the things needed and the things loved. The light dimmed again. The blue of the walls deepened to lavender. The chime at the window turned slightly with the current. Tiyanna moved to the resting alcove and took her place upon the mat. Outside, the sea darkened, The city quieted. Part 5. Descent into silence. The candle globe above her table slowly dimmed until only a faint glimmer remained, a soft pulse in time with her breathing. Tiyanna moved without haste through her dwelling, her bare feet making no sound upon the smooth floor. In her resting alcove, she lit the night diffuser, a tiny shell lamp filled with softened oils from sleep vine blossoms and blue mineral wax. Its flame was no brighter than a distant star, flickering once, then steadying into a cool shimmer that filled the space with a warm, calming scent. It reminded her faintly of dusk by the surface tide pools, long ago in her second dwelling cycle. She reached for a small lacquered box from the corner shelf. Within it lay her dream tokens, etched discs no larger than her palm, each one carved with a single symbol: silence, sea, harmony, breath, ancestor, sky. She chose one at random without looking. Tonight, it was breath, a spiral flowing inward, circling a quiet center. She placed the token in its cradle beside her bed, where it would remain throughout the night to guide her dreams. Not in a literal sense. No, Abbai believed the tokens held magic, but in a gentle one, as a way to guide the mind into the proper stillness before sleep. Then she sat on the edge of her mat, legs folded beneath her, and began her nightly breath watch. It was a simple practice. Inhale, 4 counts. Hold, 4 counts. Exhale, 6 counts. Rest, 2 counts. Repeat. Around her, the home shifted into night mode. The walls cooled further, faintly exhaling the salt-sweet air of the outer currents. The ambient light lowered to twilight tones, shades of pearl and deep sea lavender. The gentle sound of low-frequency tide pulses played from a concealed panel above her head, tuned to match the rhythms of her heartbeat. She let her thoughts float. Memories came, but they did not linger. The feel of her hands in the garden soil that morning, the clear voice of Kelsari reciting her verses, the gentle, almost imperceptible touch of the ocean current as she walked home from the archives. All of it part of the long, slow song of the day. And then, deeper thoughts, those that came only when the body was quiet enough to allow them. She thought of her mother's voice, long faded from memory except in tone and rhythm. Of the sea path journeys taken in her youth, guided by lights that no longer shone. Of friends now returned to the great stillness, remembered through their written verses and etched shells. But these too drifted like sea foam, touched lightly, then let go. She lay down at last, her body curling slightly upon the sleep mat, its surface warmed to the lowest comfort setting. The fabric wrapped her like a shell's embrace, soft and complete. She turned her head slightly toward the diffuser's flicker and let her eyes close. "May the currents cradle me," she whispered. "May the stillness find me. May my breath return me whole." There was no final thought, only quiet. Outside, the reef city of Naraan'ta continued its slow breath. Lights dimmed, currents hushed, lives gently unwinding in the dark. And Tiyanna, gardener, teacher, keeper of slow rhythms, drifted into sleep as the ocean held her, soft and deep and endless. Part 6. The Soft Return. Morning in Naraan'ta was never abrupt. There were no alarms, no sudden shifts. Instead, the world awakened in ripples. Tiyanna's eyes opened slowly, not to light, but to motion. Her sleeping mat had begun its gentle rise, lifting her spine just enough to ease the breath, to tell the body that rest was ending. A soft chime, a single low note, sounded from the diffuser cradle, signaling the end of the night cycle. Above her, the dwelling's ambient hue shifted from lavender to the palest blue-gray, as if light were filtering down through many layers of sea and sky. She did not move at once. For several minutes she lay in silence, her hands resting lightly upon her stomach, counting her breath. This was the ritual of return. After the 7th breath cycle, she sat up, slowly and without effort. Her joints moved easily, her body loose and rested. She gave thanks, not with words, but with the placement of her palms over her heart, then lifted to the ceiling, fingers open like sea petals. At the edge of the room, a round basin of morning water had been warming since the night before. She cupped a small amount into her hands and touched it to her face, her temples, the nape of her neck, cool and clarifying. The water was lightly infused with salt grass and ocean flower, bringing the soft sting of alertness with its scent. She stood, robed herself in a fresh wrap of driftweave linen, and moved to the nourishment corner of her home. Today's breakfast would be simpler than the one before. She chose a mild base of softened grain leaf porridge, to which she added a swirl of sweet Tide syrup and a small sprinkle of shelled glimmer nuts, roasted and split the evening before. For drink, a glass of sunvine water, gathered from thin, pale vines that grew near the edge of the upper domes, known for their clarity and faint citrus bite. She ate seated, as always, facing the eastern shimmer wall. The view this morning was misted. Tiny plankton blooms had drifted upward during the night, casting a soft green haze across the dome. It made the ocean outside seem dreamlike, an endless garden of suspended dust and light. Her thoughts were still. She did not review tasks. She did not plan ahead. Mornings were not for expectations. Once the meal was complete and the vessels rinsed, she tended briefly to her indoor plants, small kelp ferns in wall-hung bowls, each rooted in a blend of crushed coral and seafoam clay. One had a new frond just curling into life, barely visible unless one knew where to look. She smiled gently at it and whispered, "You're early." After setting the dwelling into day mode, which adjusted the filtration, humidity, and lighting settings for the next cycle, she prepared her outer robe, woven in a slow wave pattern to reflect the water's motion as one walked. The clasp today was of polished shellstone, shaped like a single open eye, a symbol of waking and observation. Before she left, she paused at her ancestor shelf, a small alcove carved into the corner of her resting space. It held 3 items: a smooth memory stone from her grandmother's home reef, a sealed scroll of early verses from her mentor's teachings, and a tiny piece of silver net, torn and saved from her first ocean pilgrimage. She placed her hand lightly over them and closed her eyes. Stillness behind me, stillness ahead. I walk within the middle tide. With that, she stepped out into the morning. Part 7. The Market Drift. The corridors leading to the lower market ring curved with the grace of reef channels, never in straight lines, never in a hurry. The walls here bore soft, geometric textures, raised lines etched with verse from old seasonal hymns, marking the turning of the solar path and the flow of trade tides. The walk itself was part of the ritual. Tiyanna moved among others, most robed in soft ocean tones, hands free, faces calm, Some carried woven satchels or baskets shaped like clamshells. No voices rose above a hush. No footsteps echoed beyond the soft rhythm of movement. The lower market ring itself was not a place of noise or clamor. It was a drift market, a space where vendors displayed their offerings along low crescent benches, and visitors moved in a circular flow, encouraged by the gentle current of a designed water draft that passed through the floor vents. Each vendor's station had its own scent. There was the floral brine tang of dried kelp mosaics, curled and shaped like sea feathers, the warm, grounding scent of fermented root cakes, stacked in symmetrical towers and wrapped in leaf paper tied with fiber string, the sharper aroma of tied herbs, crushed, dried, and pressed into small lozenges that could be dropped into tea or broth. Tiyanna stopped at a station run by Halis, a spice weaver she had known since their early cycles. Halis was older now, her robe darker, embroidered with family lineage threads along the hem. Her stall was simple, rows of tiny stone bowls, each holding powdered, dried, or crystallized flavor essences from across the coastal reefs. They exchanged no greeting at first. Instead, Tiyanna leaned in and inhaled gently over a bowl of crushed amber root, her eyes briefly closing. "South side?" she asked quietly. Halis smiled, a tilt of the head. "East by 2 turns. A good harvest this cycle." Tiyanna nodded, then selected a vial of powdered sunbark, a pale yellow spice known for its subtle sweetness and grounding aftertaste. She placed it gently in her basket. In return, she offered a flat coil of dried tide fruit, peeled, marinated in sea honey, and sun-dried near the city's warm western panel. They did not speak of value. The exchange itself was the measure. She moved on slowly, letting the current of foot traffic guide her. She passed a station where a soft-shell artisan molded wave glass into pendants, while a small group of observers watched in respectful silence. The glow of the shaping tool, an ion wand tipped with coral filament, reflected gently off the artisan's steady hands. At another station, a pair of young students displayed their memory scrolls, short-form verses illustrated by hand, each line representing a moment from the student's family history. These were not for trade, but for sharing. Tiyanna read 2 of them, tracing the etched grooves with her finger, then pressed her palms together in silent approval before moving on. In the center of the market was the resonance pool, a broad, shallow basin of perfectly still water, surrounded by smooth stone seating. No trading happened here. It was a place to pause, to reflect, to let the senses settle before re-entering the current of the day. Tiyanna sat at its edge, setting her basket beside her. Across the pool, others sat in pairs or alone, all watching the stillness at the center. Occasionally, a small vibration would pass through the water, caused not by movement, but by sound. A voice carried softly, a chime stirred by breeze, a footstep in rhythm. The water captured all of it. She closed her eyes, not in meditation, but in rest. For several minutes she did not move. When she rose again, the market was easing into its midday lull. Vendors began to cover their wares with cloth, and the slow current of visitors turned toward the city's outer paths. Tiyanna followed, basket in hand, the scent of sunbark and dried fruit still drifting faintly around her. She had no urgency, no destination that required haste, only the pull of the city's soft tide, and the next quiet thing waiting to be done. Part 8. threads of sound. The sun had passed its highest mark, though the light above the dome softened rather than brightened. In Naraan'ta, no harsh beam of light ever fell upon the streets or dwellings. The architects of the city had long believed that clarity did not require brilliance. It needed only time and stillness. Tiyanna walked slowly through the South Garden Walk, a long corridor lined with amber-paned glass. Beyond it, kelp forests drifted gently in the ocean's lazy current, their long leaves brushing against the outer wall like fingers trailing across fabric. Small reef birds, pale and translucent, darted between stone perches placed just beyond the filtration boundary. Their high calls rose and fell like distant chimes. Her destination stood ahead, a low, rounded building nestled within a spiral courtyard of sand, stone, and shaped water pools. The story hall, known as Kelveran, bore no signage. Those who came here already knew the way, and those who did not were invited to find it only when the time was right. She removed her sandals and stepped through the woven curtain of drift thread that served as its entrance. Inside, the light was dim and warm, filtered through overlapping veils of sea-dyed linen strung across the ceiling. Dozens of cushions formed soft rings on the floor, all arranged in slow spirals. At the center sat a low dais, bare for now, but waiting. Already several Abbai were seated. Some nodded quietly in greeting. Others remained still, their eyes closed, breathing in time with the soft pulse of the hall's ambient rhythm. Tiyanna chose a cushion along the middle spiral. It was filled with seafoam husk and flax fiber, firm but yielding. She adjusted her robe, laid her hands palm up in her lap, and waited. When the hour sounded, marked only by a breath of wind from a hidden vent and a faint chime from above, the storyteller entered. Marilyn, an elder of nearly 200 cycles, moved with a grace untouched by age. Her robe was nearly white, woven from threads so fine they shimmered with movement. She said nothing at first. She walked the full spiral inward, then seated herself on the dais and let her gaze drift across those gathered. She opened a small pouch and drew out a story stone, smooth and oval, marked with 3 interlocking waves. She turned it once in her palm, and the hall fell into perfect silence. Then her voice, soft, low, melodic. Once, before domes, before names, there was only the sea and the memory of it. And the memory shaped itself into song. And the song became form. And from form came voice. So began the tale. It was not a story of conflict, nor one of triumph or loss. It was a memory, passed from matriarch to child, of the first kelp singers who lived in open reef clusters and sang to guide the currents. Marilyn spoke slowly, every syllable a drop of water on a still surface. She wove moments together, of shell-gatherers, dream-mothers, tide-keepers. She named none of them, for they belonged to all. At times, a quiet instrument joined her, a stringed bowl harp played by a seated accompanist near the edge of the spiral. Its tones were low and resonant, each note stretching into the next like the breath between verses. Tiyanna let the sound flow through her, her eyes half closed. Her breath matched the rhythm of the tale. The words did not carry urgency. They carried texture, like smooth sand beneath the tide, like heat on a stone after sunset. As the story moved to its final turn, Marilyn traced a circle in the air above the stone, then placed it carefully beside her on the dais. She bowed her head once, a gesture of release. The hall remained silent for a time after her voice ceased. Then, slowly, the listeners rose, some in pairs, others alone, and filed quietly out through the curtain. No applause, no discussion. The tale was meant to linger in the mind like scent in the air, changing shape with memory. Tiyanna left last. Outside, the light had shifted again. The shadows of the spiral courtyard were longer, and the scent of cool mineral air reached her from the ocean vents. She placed a small pearl token in the offering shell near the entrance, a gesture of thanks to the teller, to the hall, and to the ancestors who carried the stories forward. She walked home slowly, the words of the tale echoing not in her mind, but in the spaces between thoughts. Part 9. The Garden of Sound. By the time Tiyanna reached the edge of the western crest, the light above Naraan'ta had taken on its late afternoon tones: dusty rose, soft copper, pale indigo. These were not the colors of the sun above the waves, but of water filtered through time and distance. The city slowed accordingly. She followed a narrow path bordered by sleeping bloom vines and quiet scent pools, each one tuned to release its fragrance only when passed in silence. A few other Abbai walked ahead or behind her, spaced naturally by the rhythm of their steps, no one hurrying, no one speaking. The floating music garden was suspended on the surface of the upper tide pool, held aloft by tension-balanced rings of coral alloy and biolattice. From above, it looked like a great, open blossom, petals of light and tone drifting outward across the water. From below, it shimmered like a dream. Tiyanna entered barefoot, as was custom. The garden's floor was not solid, but a slow-moving membrane stretched taut across the supporting frame, gently swaying with the water below. Each step was a ripple, each movement part of a larger song. Small tone pools surrounded the space, shallow basins tuned to respond to vibration. A touch, a footfall, even a breath placed near their surface could trigger a soft chime, a harmonic, a murmur of sound. These were not instruments in the traditional sense. They were collaborators, part of a conversation between presence and space. Tiyanna took her place on one of the outer petals, seated cross-legged on a yielding mat of woven sponge grass. Around her, others did the same. An elder placed a stone gently into one of the pools, watching the ripples travel outward. A pair of siblings traced patterns in the air with glimmer sticks, their motions slow and precise. Then, without signal or word, the resonance ritual began. Not performance, not spectacle. A single tone rose from the center, a long, low hum from a wind harp strung between two reed pillars. Its pitch wavered slightly, shaped by the direction of the current. It was joined moments later by a soft percussion. Shells tapped lightly together, once every breath cycle. Then another voice, a singer, or perhaps several, their tones layered so gently that no single voice stood apart. There were no lyrics, only open vowel sounds stretched into melody. Ooh, ah, ee. The sound moved like water. Slow, warm, immersive. Tiyanna closed her eyes. Her breath found the rhythm easily, her thoughts melting into the weave of sound and silence. She placed her hand lightly upon the tone pool beside her, and it sang, just barely, a soft chime like glass touched by mist. She did not move again. All around her the music unfolded, not in direction, but in depth. It was a slow descent, a spiral inward, not meant to guide the mind toward meaning, but to dissolve it. In that space there was no past or future, only the shape of breath, the echo of stillness, and the memory of sea. She stayed in the garden for the full cycle until the final tone faded into the water and was replaced by the natural rhythm of the reef below. A silence not empty, but complete. Then, as one, the participants rose, retrieved their shoes or sandals in silence, and departed along the outer bridge paths. Some smiled. Others bowed lightly in gratitude to the wind harp. No one spoke. Words would only disturb the quiet that had been made. Tiyanna's steps were slower now, not from fatigue, but from softness. She walked home with her hands folded gently in front of her thoughts as still as the sea at slack tide. Behind her, the garden of sound faded into the soft hues of the falling light, its music now part of her breath. Part 10. A Meal of Silence. The walk back from the floating music garden was slower still than her walk there, each step carrying the remnants of song and stillness. The corridors of Naraan'ta had emptied into evening quiet, where only the soft hum of current regulators and the distant echo of closing filtration panels remained. As she approached her dwelling, the outer lights along the footpath shifted to evening bloom, a faint rose gold that made the coral walls glow softly, as if remembering the sun's warmth from long ago. Her door recognized her by step and posture, opening without a sound. Inside, the room welcomed her with dim amber light and the subtle shift in air pressure that signaled the home's full transition into night phase. The walls cooled, the scent of the sleep diffuser gently strengthened, and the tonal background dropped into the lowest range, barely perceptible, like the memory of a hum. Tiyanna did not remove her robe immediately. Instead, she stood near the window, watching the slow drift of water outside. Tiny silver plankton shimmered in the distance, catching what little light remained from the upper dome's glow. A long fish, slow and ribbon-shaped, glided past, unhurried, its silhouette elongated like a thought stretched too far to finish. She turned away at last, moving toward the nourishment alcove, her body still attuned to the resonance from the garden. This night's meal would be modest by even Abbai standards. She selected a portion of warm-simmered sea lentils, softened with crushed root tuber and mixed with fine slivers of stone fruit rind. From a small cooling vessel, she retrieved 2 pieces of salt-glazed kelp bread, folded and layered with thin slices of preserved reef mushrooms, tangy and faintly sweet. To drink, a warmed infusion of twilight blossom, its petals steeped gently in mineral water until the flavor bloomed like dusk on the tongue. The preparation took little time, but she moved slowly, reverently. Each item was placed on the table with care. Her single dining stone, worn smooth from decades of use, was set at the center of the table, a simple circle of gray and violet hues. It bore no markings. Its function was not decorative, but grounding. She ran her fingers over it once, then sat. She ate in silence, as always. Not because there was no one to speak to, but because this time was meant for integration, of thought, of presence, of the events of the day, not relived, but allowed to settle like silt in still water. Each bite was measured and mindful, each sip a return to breath. She paused often, not for distraction, but for presence. When the meal was complete, she placed the used vessels in the cleansing basin, where gentle currents and bio-cleaning enzymes would tend to them overnight. She dried her hands slowly, folded the towel in thirds, and returned it to its holder. She made no checklist. She reviewed no plans. The day had unfolded as it should, without urgency, without absence. She had been present for all of it, and now it was passing into memory. She stood once more before the ancestor shelf, this time not to speak, but to listen. No voice came, of course, only the feeling of continuity, of having added one more quiet breath to the long inhalation of her people's memory. Then, without another word, she turned toward her resting alcove. Part 11. Drift Beneath the Tides. The diffuser lamp flickered once, then settled into its final rhythm for the cycle, pulsing low and slow, like the breath of a creature long asleep. Its scent, a blend of sleep vine and polished kelp root, hung in the air like warmth remembered through water. The scent wrapped the space like a cloak. Tiyanna moved with calm intention. She stepped into the cleansing pool one last time, letting the warmed water lap at her ankles and wrists, brushing the day from her skin. There was no sponge now, no scrubbing. This was not about removal, but release. Above her, the ceiling panels closed into night configuration. Small flecks of bioluminescent stone embedded in the ceiling glimmered faintly, forming a soft echo of the constellations once visible from Abbai's surface, long before the domes, before the ocean swallowed the sky. She remembered them only dimly, stories passed to her as a child, verses chanted beside mineral lamps, maps traced not with ink but with song. Each cluster had meaning, but not for navigation. The Abbai had no need for direction. Their movement was never linear. They followed depth, not distance. Drying her hands, she returned to the resting alcove and opened her small box of dream tokens. Tonight, her hand found the one etched with flowing stone, a symbol of memory enduring despite the pressure of time. She traced the groove with one fingertip, then placed it beside her mat. The mat had already softened into its night shape, its internal structure relaxing in response to her proximity. She lay down slowly, head sinking into the gentle arc of her pillow, legs folding lightly, hands resting upon her belly. She exhaled. Outside, the reef was still. Inside, her home dimmed further, until the only light came from the token's cradle and the breath glow of the diffuser. Her thoughts began to drift, not in words, but in images. A long, kelp-lined trench glowing with ancient, untranslatable glyphs. A fish made of ribbon and light, weaving in and out of hollow coral. A younger version of herself, singing to a sprouting bloom in the sand, unaware of time, untouched by grief. These were not memories, nor were they dreams. They were something else. Sea thoughts, as her mother used to call them. The soft echoes of the world returning her attention in different shapes. She let them come and go. She did not try to guide them. They were not a current to control. They were the still waters of the deep, old, slow, and infinite. At last, as her breath matched the pulse of the diffuser and her mind released its final waking thread, she whispered the last rite of her day. I am within. The world is without. Let the sea hold both. And then, with no barrier left between breath and dream, between self and silence, she slept. Part 12. A Different Current. Tiyanna awoke before the dwelling systems gently stirred the room to life. This was unusual, though not troubling. Her eyes opened to near total darkness. Only the faintest shimmer from the diffuser remained, pulsing like a tide in the distance. She did not sit up right away. Instead, she lay still, sensing the world before engaging it. Her breath was even, her body rested. But something, subtle and silent, had shifted. She turned her head slightly. Outside, the sea beyond the dome glowed faintly with an unusual luminescent haze. The coloration was softer than usual, a pale silver violet, not the blues and greens of the usual early cycle. Plankton bloom, a rare one. Even through the thick, tempered dome glass, she could sense its presence. Millions of microscopic organisms, drifting just beyond the city's upper filters, casting an otherworldly sheen over everything. It would last only a few hours, perhaps a single cycle, a quiet event, a gift. She rose slowly, robe slung over her shoulders without a clasp. No need. Today she would stay inside a little longer. In the nourishment corner, she prepared her morning tea with the same motions as always: boiling water, gently crushed blossom, 1/2 leaf of citrus kelp. But she did not sit in her usual place. Instead, she brought her cup to the window cushion and seated herself beside the glass. She watched. Outside, the bloom pulsed like a breath made visible. The drifting clusters of plankton shimmered, reflecting the early dome light and magnifying it with motion. Nothing fast, nothing urgent, just a long, slow shimmer, like light remembered from a dream. It reminded her of something. Not a specific moment, but a feeling. Of being small, not in a diminished way, but in a held one. As a child, floating in the quiet pools near the shallow reef, staring upward at the layers of sunlight breaking through the waves. Her mother had called that light sea fire. She had sung old verses to it while they floated, her voice just above the whisper of the current. Oh, light that drifts. Oh, light that stays. Carry me through the stillest days, not for speed and not for sound, only breath and sea and ground. Tiyanna had not thought of that verse in years. She sipped her tea. It was warmer than usual, the temperature slightly overinfused, but the imperfection felt right. Like the kind of imperfection that made stories believable, or flavors memorable. The kind of thing her mentor used to say gave anchor to otherwise perfect days. The dwelling was silent. She moved slowly from cushion to mat, taking her tea with her, letting the scent drift through the resting space. There would be no tending to the garden just yet. The bloom might delay the nutrient filtration system. No harm in waiting. The plants would understand. They, too, belonged to the rhythm of the ocean. She retrieved her memory scroll case, a long, rounded container made of sea-polished wood, and opened it with a twist of her thumb. Inside were the unbound scrolls of her own thoughts. Not formal records, not teachings, but small passages written in quiet moments, never shared. She unrolled one at random and read. Today the sea forgot to rise. Not because it was tired, but because it was listening. She smiled not at the cleverness of the words, there was none, but at the simplicity of the memory behind them. A quiet morning, a still reef, a bowl of tea, much like this one. Tiyanna spent the next while not doing anything at all. She did not meditate nor plan. She did not reflect on the story hall or think ahead to her next lesson. She simply allowed herself to be, within the dwelling, beside the sea, beneath the bloom. Eventually, the light began to change. The shimmer of the bloom softened, faded. The regular hues of Naraan'ta returned, and the city shifted forward once more. Tiyanna stood. Today would begin soon. But it had already been, in the quietest, most complete way possible. Part 13. Lessons in Light. By mid-morning, the bloom had faded fully. The sea outside the dome returned to its usual spectrum. Muted greens, soft blue-gray, the faint gold of filtered sunlight drifting downward like slow-moving threads. The light felt ordinary, but not diminished. It was like waking after a vivid dream. The world the same, and yet touched with something it hadn't had the day before. Tiyanna walked the curved path to the archive hall, robe clasped in silver now, her stride as measured as always. But her thoughts carried the softness of the bloom, the way its shimmer had wrapped the morning in silver silence. Even the hum of the city's life support systems, so constant as to often disappear, seemed now a part of the harmony, rather than background to it. As she entered the archive, she paused to let her fingers trail along the entry tablet, a slab of reef stone etched with old poetic lines about the preservation of memory. She read them again, not because she had forgotten them, but because sometimes the mind needed reminding of what it already knew. Inside, the air was cool and dry, as always, but it carried the faintest undertone of salt-roasted flax. Someone had recently refreshed the scroll cases. She took her seat by the curved teaching alcove, a crescent of stone backed by textured wall panels depicting the phases of the Abbai's second moon. Not long after, her apprentice Kelsari arrived. Robes lightly rumpled, breath just a little fast. "You rose late," Tiyanna said without reproach. Kelsari gave a sheepish nod. "The bloom. I dreamt I was inside it." Tiyanna gestured toward the cushion across from her. "A good dream, then." The younger woman sat, adjusting her posture. "I was floating without movement. I couldn't see my hands. I wasn't afraid." "Then you were exactly where you should be," Tiyanna replied, pleased. Today's lesson was to be a reading of partial verses, a practice where the student received a line or fragment from ancient verse, and was asked to complete it through intonation and rhythm, not logic. It was not meant to create poetry, but to sense the breath of meaning behind form. Tiyanna unrolled a scroll of drift-inked shells, each etched with incomplete lines from the voices of sand and silence, an ancestral work rarely taught outside of intimate apprenticeship. She handed the first shell across the low table. "The tide forgets the stone, but—" Kelsari paused, brows lightly furrowed. Then she took a breath and continued. "The stone remembers the tide." Tiyanna gave no correction, only a light bow of approval. A second shell. "We spoke with hands when the water—" was too deep for voice. Another pause, then a third. "I was not alone. I was with—" the sea, and it did not mind my silence. At this, Tiyanna exhaled a slow, pleased breath. "You're listening more now," she said. Kelsari smiled faintly. "I think the bloom made the world quieter. I didn't want to disturb it." Tiyanna reached into the pouch beside her and withdrew a pale blue inkstone. She set it between them. "Then write. Not a verse, not a scroll, just a trace, whatever remains of your dream." Kelsari dipped the stylus. The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the gentle scratching of stone on shell, the occasional creak of the scroll racks shifting in the soft current of ventilation and the quiet rhythm of breath between two people, teacher and student, presence and presence. Tiyanna did not guide the rest of the session. Instead, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lightly closed, the shimmer of the morning still dancing somewhere behind her closed eyelids. Not as an image now, but as a feeling. Light, silence, and the trust that even the briefest beauty can echo through everything that follows. Part 14. Beneath the Bloom. By midday, Tiyanna made her way back to the lower reef terraces. The garden, her garden, waited as it always had, nestled in its shallow crescent beneath the city's core. The spiral stairwell down hummed softly with temperature equalization currents. The etched coral stone beneath her feet was cool to the touch, and each step carried with it a rhythm she had known for decades. But as she descended, she noticed subtle changes. The light that filtered through the dome above had regained its usual clarity, yet here and there, soft flecks of bloom residue clung to the edges of the outer nutrient grid. Tiny, glimmering threads, as if the morning's light had chosen to stay just a little longer in the depths. She paused near the bottom step, breathing in the familiar scent. Wet mineral, slow-growing kelp root, the faint sweetness of whisper-leaf pollen suspended in the water. Then she stepped into the garden itself. Immediately she felt it. Not a change in structure, but in rhythm. The plants had absorbed the bloom's presence like a memory passed in sleep. The elder root fans were leaning subtly westward, as if following a current she couldn't detect. The whisper-leaf rows displayed a new pattern in their bioluminescence. Less of a wave, more of a slow spiral, pulsing inward. She moved between them silently, brushing fingertips along stems and leaves. Each one responded with a soft shimmer of color or motion, not out of reaction, but out of recognition. At the pool of symbiotic shelled feeders, she noticed one cluster had begun a new clutch, translucent eggs shaped like tiny seeds, each pulsing faintly with internal light. It was early for such a cycle. The bloom must have triggered it. She knelt beside the pool and let her hand hover just above the surface. The water was warmer than expected. She reached into her belt pouch and retrieved a memory reed, a hollow tube used to record subtle environmental readings. She dipped it into the pool, watched it fill slowly, then sealed it with a twist of her fingers. She would analyze the sample later, not out of urgency, but curiosity. Still kneeling, she watched as one of the symbiotic creatures, barely longer than her thumb, with petal-like fins and a delicate, ribbed shell, drifted up to the surface and hovered near her hand. Its fins fluttered, touching her skin with the lightness of air. She smiled. The garden was always changing, always becoming. The bloom had not disrupted its balance. It had reminded it of growth, of receptivity, of rhythm deeper than routine. She moved slowly through the rows for the next while, making minor adjustments to nutrient threads, brushing away sediment, realigning one of the root anchors near the eastern edge. Nothing demanding, just the presence of care. When she finished, she paused in the center of the terraced rows, seated on the flat stone she had placed there long ago, smoothed by years of breath and thought. From this point, she could see the full curve of the garden, the long rows of food plants, the ornamental bloom beds near the far wall, the soft shimmer of the filtration dome above, reflecting the sea's pale light back down in broad waves. She let her eyes drift out of focus, not sleeping, not thinking, simply existing, within the echo of the bloom, within the breath of her garden, within the soft, continuous tide of the city around her. Part 15. A Circle of Light. Evening in Naraan'ta began not with sunset, but with a lowering of tone. The city's ambient systems gradually shifted frequencies, transitioning from the faint hum of active filtration to a deeper, slower current of sound, one that resonated in the chest more than the ears. Lights followed, growing warmer and softer, the pale indigo of early dusk settling into amber and rose. Tiyanna returned home only briefly after tending her garden. She rinsed her hands and feet in warm water perfumed with salt grass, exchanged her robe for one of lighter weave, undyed flax-colored fabric threaded with coral red lining, and stepped back into the cooling air. Tonight, she walked without destination. But like all things in Naraan'ta, her path became shaped by intention she did not name. Her feet brought her to the upper reflection courtyard, a circular, open space lined with low benches carved from reef stone and smooth driftwood. In its center lay a shallow mirror pool, no more than ankle deep, filled with slow-cycling water warmed gently from below. Already others had arrived. The Abbai did not summon gatherings. They simply formed, spurred by shared impressions, like currents joining from different sources. The bloom, brief and radiant, had left its echo in many, and so the courtyard slowly filled with people drawn by the same quiet need, not to explain, but to reflect. Tiyanna entered the circle silently. She greeted a pair of elders with a light touch of her fingers to her chest, nodded to Salasha, who sat with legs folded, eyes closed. Across the circle, a young parent cradled a sleeping child, their heads resting together in a shared rhythm of breath. No one spoke right away. Instead, the ritual began in gesture. One by one, those seated lifted a small object or offering, something that captured what the bloom had stirred in them. Tiyanna watched as a weaver held up a ribbon of light thread dyed in silver hues, its edges curled like a plankton bloom. A reef singer beside her offered a chord played on a reed flute. A slow, rising interval, then fall, like a sigh made of sound. When it was her turn, Tiyanna reached into her sash and pulled forth a single memory scroll. Not one of teaching, nor ancestral verse, but one she had written long ago. It was plain. A short passage. I was quiet. The world was quieter. I stayed that way, and it stayed with me. She placed the scroll in the center dish beside the pool. No applause, no comment, only a few nods of understanding. Salasha, seated nearby, lifted a clear vessel, empty but for a single drop of water. She held it to the light. I dreamt the bloom spoke, she said softly, but not in words, only in shape. Tiyanna nodded, the gesture slow and deep. Another Abbai, her robe patterned with wind symbols, offered a short line of verse from an ancestor she did not name. You do not carry the stillness carries you. And so the circle continued. For nearly an hour they passed quiet offerings, songs without lyrics, lines of motion traced in the air, a shell carved with patterns seen in dream, a piece of unfinished weaving, a single polished stone, each offering a presence, not a performance. Tiyanna leaned back against the driftwood bench and let herself listen. The sound of water moving in the pool, the breath of those around her. the occasional faint chime from the deeper current vents as the outer tide shifted, and within her, a softness that had settled into place like sediment falling through quiet water. Eventually, the circle dissolved. Not all at once and not with any formality. People stood when they were ready, exchanged small nods or touches, and drifted out along the curved paths like pieces of kelp borne on the current. Tiyanna remained seated a few moments longer. The light was low now, the water in the mirror pool glowing faintly from the heat below. Her scroll still rested in the center. She would leave it. Someone else might read it or not. It did not matter. The scroll had served its purpose, to hold a feeling, then release it. She rose quietly and walked the long way home, her path lit by the pale dome glow and the distant hum of reef life settling into night. Part 16. Soft Ash of Light. The corridors of Naraan'ta whispered around her as Tiyanna returned home, her steps guided more by rhythm than intention. The outer dome lights had dimmed to their final phase, a deep slate blue streaked with lines of amber and violet, the last echo of day refracted through many layers of ocean and glass. She reached her doorway and touched the entry crest, not because she needed to. It already recognized her presence, but as a gesture of completion, of return. Inside, the home was still. It had been resting, waiting. The walls glowed faintly with ambient warmth. The temperature had lowered slightly. The diffuser lamp pulsed with its slow nighttime rhythm, barely perceptible, like breath in sleep. The tones of the room's resonance panels had deepened to the threshold of hearing, providing an auditory embrace as she moved through the space. She removed her robe without ceremony, folding it in 4 careful layers and placing it on the side perch to air. Her feet made no sound across the floor. In the nourishment corner, she poured a small bowl of cooled root milk, infused with crushed spice pearl and blossom rind. It was not a meal, only a gesture, a way to invite stillness into the body. She drank slowly, her fingers cradling the curved ceramic rim. Each sip was a settling. Each swallow, a reminder to exhale. Then she moved to her resting alcove. Tonight, she did not select a dream token. The bloom had already left its shape in her mind, and she saw no need to impose another. Instead, she placed an open shell in the cradle, unmarked, empty, gleaming faintly in the soft lamplight. A symbol of readiness, of receiving. She lay down without thought. Her mat cradled her, adjusting automatically to the curves of her body, the subtle heat of her spine, the pressure points of her hips and shoulders. The pillow, warm and steady, cupped the base of her head like a tide pool stone. For a few moments, she simply breathed. Hold, exhale, rest. Outside, the reef was fully quiet now. The city's systems had entered their maintenance cycle, barely audible pulses, long intervals of silence. Even the fish had drifted deeper, drawn by instinct to the hidden trenches where current and stillness meet. She turned once, settling further. Her thoughts, if they could be called that, were not formed. They were impressions, soft and formless. A pale bloom shimmering beyond memory. A scroll passed without comment. A circle of silence shaped by presence. She felt no need to hold any of it tightly. She did not sleep suddenly. There was no edge to fall over, no threshold to cross. Only the long slide downward into warmth and weightlessness, like descending into deeper layers of water, where light becomes memory and thought becomes breath. the room dimmed further. The diffuser flame shrank to a final glimmer, and Tiyanna, Abbai gardener, keeper of rhythms, teacher of the slow and sacred, sank quietly into the sea of sleep, carried by stillness, cradled by breath. Part 17. A Voice from the Current. Tiyanna awoke slowly, as she always did, her body moving first in breath, then in thought. The mat beneath her softened in response, adjusting to the subtle shift of her weight as she stretched, spine long, toes curling. The morning diffuser had begun its low glow, cool peach light fading slowly toward silver blue. In the air, the faint scent of tide petal and warmed shell cedar signaled a fresh cycle. She sat up without hurry, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The dream of the bloom had lingered, though now, as she breathed it away, it had lost its shape. Only a sense of motion remained, like a ripple traveling outward from where a stone had once touched water. She rose, washed with mineral water warmed by night heat, and robed herself in soft gray linen. A robe she wore only when her thoughts were unsettled, not with worry, but with expectation. There was no sound, no message, but something in the current of the day felt different. Not unbalanced, but turning slightly, like a reed shifting to face a new breeze. She prepared her tea in silence, letting the steam spiral upward. She ate 2 small wafers of pressed sunroot with dried seafruit pulp. Her hands moved by memory alone. Then, just after the final sip, the chime at her entry crest sounded, a soft, clear note, like the drop of water into a shell. She tilted her head slightly. Not scheduled, not anticipated. She stepped to the threshold and touched the panel. The outer drift curtain shimmered once, parted, and revealed a tall figure in a robe of worn copper and gray, sea-salted at the hem. His eyes were familiar, though marked by time. Thalin, a cousin, once close, a fellow student under the same mentor. He had left Naraan'ta many cycles ago to live in the upper ocean colonies, those set near the volcanic ridges where light rarely reached, and where silence was deeper than stone. He bowed deeply, arms extended, not formal but complete. Tiyanna mirrored him. "You have returned," she said simply. "I dreamed of the bloom," he replied, "before it came." She stepped aside, and he entered without needing to be shown the way. They sat at her window cushion, where the light played across the outer dome, casting slow-moving patterns on the walls. She poured more tea. He accepted it without comment. They did not speak for a while. Their breath aligned naturally, as it had once done in younger days. Finally, he reached into the folds of his robe and withdrew a carved drift stone, etched with spiral script and the subtle pattern of a kelp frond, a symbol of returning from great depth. He set it on the low table. "I found this at the base of a trench," he said, "half buried in sediment. It isn't mine." Tiyanna studied it. The lines were familiar. She stood, crossed to her memory shelf, and returned with a small stone of her own, similar in size and shape. Its pattern was not identical, but complementary. "They were carved by a Laren," she said softly, "before her final descent." Thalin nodded. "I felt her in the dream, and then the bloom came." Neither needed to ask whether the bloom had meaning. Its presence had already shaped the current of their lives. They sat together for some time, tea warming their hands, silence warming the room. The reef outside drifted slowly. A pair of windfish glided past the dome in opposite directions, then curled around in lazy arcs, crossing paths again. "I'm staying for a while," Thalin said at last. "Not long, just long enough." Tiyanna smiled gently. "Then the guest mat is yours, and the garden is waiting." There was no need for ceremony, no call to action, only the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the sea brings someone home, not loudly, not with waves, but with the subtle change in current that guides a swimmer back to shore. Part 18. Returning Hands. Later that morning, without fanfare, they made their way to the garden. Thalin said little as they walked, his fingers brushing lightly against the textured walls of the corridor, as if reacquainting himself with the feel of the city. Tiyanna led the way not as a guide, but as a companion. The soft slap of sandals against ceramic tile marked their shared pace. The descent to the garden spiral felt different with two. The resonance tiles responded subtly, the tones slightly altered by Thalin's longer stride and the way his hand lingered on the carved rail. She noticed, but said nothing. The dome overhead shimmered with the lazy blue-green glow of midday ocean light. The terraced rows of whisperleaf, bloom vine, and nutrient kelp swayed in their predictable dance as if they had never stopped. But as she stepped onto the soft stone path, she saw something new. The sprouting of star-root tendrils near the central pool. Another result of the bloom, perhaps. Thalin paused before the beds, eyes taking in the structured beauty of the terraces, the layered balance of color and form. His breath slowed, his shoulders lowered. "You kept her rhythm," he said. Tiyanna turned a leaf between her fingers, inspecting its edge. "It was never mine alone." They worked without speaking. Tiyanna passed Thalin a coil of binding thread and gestured to a cluster of wandering creepers encroaching on the root fans. He nodded, and with steady fingers began the slow process of guiding the growth back into its arc. His movements were different than hers, broader, with pauses, but still careful, still aligned with the garden's pace. She moved to the water pool to check the temperature flow. The symbiotic swimmers had grown more active since yesterday. Tiny eddies swirled where nutrient channels met, and a few small younglings glimmered just beneath the surface. Thalin joined her. He crouched beside the pool, watching in silence. "They've nested early," he murmured. "Yes," she said. "The bloom woke something." He reached toward the water but stopped short, letting the edge of his shadow fall across the rippling surface. "I used to believe things changed only when asked," he said, voice low. "But this wasn't asked." Tiyanna rinsed her hands in the side basin and dried them on a suncloth. "The sea never asks," she replied. "It offers, and we either shape to it or drift from it." He smiled faintly. They moved together through the remaining rows. She adjusted moisture levels in the high-capped coral tubes. He trimmed the edge of a light-sensitive frond that had curled too tightly. Their presence, shared and unhurried, gave the space a deeper stillness than solitude. Later, they paused at the center stone, the flat seat where Tiyanna often rested at midday. She sat first, her hands in her lap. He followed, lowering himself slowly. Around them, the plants swayed. The reef beyond the dome shimmered with light, their breath aligned. No words passed between them for a long time. Then Tiyanna reached into her robe and pulled out a small shell disc, etched with a triple spiral, a symbol of shared cycle. She handed it to him without explanation. Thalin accepted it, turning it in his palm. "It still fits," he said. Tiyanna nodded. It was always meant to. And the garden, once tended by one, now breathed beneath the hands of two, returning, remembering, and becoming again. Part 19. A Meal of Return. Evening in Naraan'ta settled over the reef like a shawl of softened light. The day's final tone drifted through the dome's upper vents, low, resonant, barely more than a breath against the walls. Lights shifted, warming into shades of coral and copper. The air cooled, salted by the outer current's exhale. Everywhere the city slowed. Tiyanna moved easily through her home, her robe now exchanged for a lighter wrap, its fabric the color of clouded pearl. She gathered items from their cool storage bowls, a wedge of sea marrow root, tender and faintly sweet, a cluster of drift fungi, sliced thin, and a small bundle of sunweed stalks, crisp and mineral-rich. Her hands worked without thought, the motions familiar and grounding. Thalin stood nearby, not hovering, simply present. When she handed him the cutting board, he accepted it without question. His hands, broader than hers, moved with deliberate grace as he chopped the fungi into near-perfect rounds. She poured a ladle of broth into a wide-mouthed ceramic pot, stirring in shaved stone fruit rind and powdered reef salt. The scent that rose, savory with a hint of sea blossom, filled the room like a memory unfolding. They spoke little. Words came only when needed, a gesture to the herb bowl, a question of texture, a quiet confirmation of readiness. Silence was not awkward here. It was a thread that wove them together, pulled from years past and braided into the present. When the meal was ready, they carried it to the low table beside the western wall, where the outer dome gave a view of the open sea. Tonight, the water shimmered with residual bloom light. Faint now, but still lingering like the final verses of a song. Tiyanna poured them each a cup of warm evening grain tea, its surface dusted with crushed kelp seed. She set the meal between them, the broth steaming gently in its earthen pot, a side of flatbread wrapped in leaf cloth, a dish of pickled tideberries. They ate slowly. Between sips and bites, they watched the reef drift. A school of glimmerfish passed by the dome. Long-bodied, faintly glowing, their formation a fluid dance of instinct and balance. Neither Tiyanna nor Thalin spoke as they watched. The sight needed no narration. After a while, Thalin set down his cup and looked across the table. "You've made this place whole," he said. She met his gaze, steady but soft. "It was always whole. I've just stayed long enough to see it keep becoming." He nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "I forgot how still it can be. Out at the ridge, everything hums too loud, even silence." "You needed to go," she said. "And I needed to come back," he replied. She offered no reply, only passed him another piece of bread. He accepted it with a slight bow of the head, the Abbai gesture of acknowledgement without insistence. When the meal was done, they cleared the table together, each washing a dish, folding a cloth, refilling the teapot. They moved without instruction, as though they had done this every evening for 100 cycles. Later, as the lights dimmed to their final shade and the diffuser lamp glowed with soft, bloom-scented vapor, they sat once more near the window. The water outside was still. Tiyanna leaned back slightly. You'll sleep in the guest alcove? Thalen nodded. If the sea will have me. She smiled gently. It always has. And so, without farewells or ceremony, they parted for the night, each to their own quiet, breath, and rest. Part 20. The Voice Above. Tiyanna woke to sound, not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable. The low, rolling resonance of a surface storm drifted through the outer shell of the dome. It was distant, its center high above, far beyond the reef shelf, but its touch reached even here, not with force, but with depth. She lay still on her mat, one hand resting over her chest, feeling the vibration in the walls. Not the sound itself, but the movement of sound, slow pulses that passed through stone and water and body alike. Outside her window, the sea had dimmed to a heavy gray-green. Light shimmered in long, slow strokes, occasionally fractured by distant flashes from the surface. These flashes did not illuminate the city so much as echo through it. Light without brightness, seen as a feeling rather than a vision. She sat up, not hurriedly, and moved to her basin. The water here had grown slightly cooler as the dome's temperature controls adjusted in response to the pressure shifts above. She washed with slow motions, savoring the chill against her palms and cheeks. As she robed herself in a wrap of warm gray flax, loose and soft, with sleeves that fell just past her fingertips, she heard another sound, the gentle stir of footsteps in the outer corridor. Thalen. She stepped into the main room as he entered. His robe was darker today, the color of deep coral at twilight. He said nothing at first, only nodded. Then, "You hear it?" Tiyanna smiled faintly. "I feel it." He moved to the window cushion, lowered himself with care. At the ridge, storms sound like the cracking of stone. Here it's lower, older. Tiyanna joined him. The diffuser lamp still glowed dimly in the corner, its cycle not yet reset for the day. Its scent, bloom leaf and salt mineral, seemed fitting. Outside, currents swirled with unusual weight. Even the smaller fish clung to rock and reef, their motion hesitant. She poured them both warm grain water, adding a thread of root syrup for grounding. They drank slowly. "Will it pass quickly?" Thalen asked. "Perhaps," she replied, "but it doesn't matter." "No?" "No storm reaches the city with anger, only with presence." He closed his eyes and leaned back slightly. The walls vibrated again, soft, low, like the sea sighing from its depths. Then, slowly, the tones of the city's infrastructure shifted to match the storm above. The resonance vents, the filtration rhythms, even the tonal markers in the floor tiles, all began to follow a deeper cycle. The city was listening. Tiyanna stood and gestured toward the garden stair. Thalen raised an eyebrow. "Now?" She nodded once. "Storms change everything. I want to see what it's changed below." They dressed for wet air, pulling on light environmental wraps and low-tread sandals. The stairwell to the garden carried the storm's voice more clearly now, a low, thrumming chant that echoed gently off the walls. Even the light had changed, becoming shadowed and tinted with soft green and amber. When they stepped into the garden, the difference was immediate. The plants swayed not with current, but with resonance. Tiny pulses moving through the roots and soil, making the stalks quiver gently in place. The filtration dome above them shimmered with stormlight, its surface reflecting long, wandering waves of pressure. At the nutrient pool, the symbiotic swimmers had grown still, not hidden, still, hovering in place, gently rocking with the water. Their eyes, small and translucent, blinked slowly as Tiyanna approached. She reached into the water. It vibrated around her hand, not with cold, but with motion. She smiled. "The storm is singing," she said softly. Thalin touched the edge of a broad whisper leaf and felt it quiver in reply. And they're listening. For the next while, they did not tend the garden. They simply sat, on the flat central stone, side by side, facing the shimmer of the dome. The storm pulsed above, not with threat, but with weight, a reminder of what lay beyond, of a world vast and layered, always moving, even when unseen. And beneath it, Naraan'ta listened. And beneath that, Tiyanna and Thalin breathed. Part 21. The Quiet Turning. By midday, the tone of the storm had deepened. Its rhythm had slowed further, no longer pulsing with energy, but resonating like an ancient drum submerged beneath the ocean floor. The light overhead remained dim, carrying the faint hue of distant thunderclouds. It was a day set inward. Within Naraan'ta, the system chimes shifted to a rare configuration, played only a few times each cycle. 3 slow bell tones echoed across the domes, followed by a fourth, one of absence. It was not silence exactly, but a pause, a breath left unfinished. Tiyanna, seated at her window cushion beside Thalin, recognized it at once. "The quiet turning," she said. Thalin looked over, his brow softening. "I've not been here for one in years." She nodded. "It's time." They rose. No one called them. No message was sent. And yet throughout Naraan'ta others began to stir, leaving homes, stepping into walkways, robes drawn close and hoods raised, not for protection, but for focus. Tiyanna and Thalin walked together in silence, their steps soundless on the soft ceramic floor of the inner spiral walk. They followed the slow turn of the corridor toward the chamber of resting tone, a circular space hidden deep in the central reef stone. Neither temple nor hall, but something in between. It welcomed them with no door, only a gradual opening into darkness and stillness. Inside, a soft underglow lit the floor with bands of kelp-colored green and pale gold. The room's walls were smooth and curved, designed to hold and dissolve sound rather than carry it. And, at the center, a single pillar of still water rose from the floor, contained only by motionless surface tension, impossibly still. They joined the circle already forming. 50 or so Abbai stood in silence, forming rings around the central water column. No one made eye contact. No one gestured. They simply took their places, allowing the rhythm of the moment to hold them. When the last note of the storm passed overhead, heard only as the faintest trembling through the stone beneath their feet, a low hum began. Not from voice, from the room itself. Resonance plates in the walls, attuned to external pressure and deep current shift, began to sing. A single tone at first, a low, resonant hum that passed through bone rather than air. It vibrated not in the ears but in the sternum, the shoulders, the soles of the feet. Then a second tone emerged, a perfect fifth above the first, creating a warm harmonic. Then a third, soft and high, like the whistle of wind far beneath the sea. No one moved, not to perform, not to impress. They listened. Tiyanna let her arms rest loosely at her sides. She closed her eyes. The tones became her breath. The breath became her center. All thoughts drifted outward like motes on the current. She was not remembering. She was not dreaming. She was only being. The tones changed slowly, imperceptibly. They bent and curved as if pulled by the storm's voice above, as though the ocean and the city were tuning themselves to the same key. A harmony not of music, but of state. Beside her, Thalen stood with his eyes closed, a small tremor in his hand. She did not ask. She did not touch. This ritual was for everyone, and for no one in particular. It simply passed through them like a deep tide. When the final tone ended, no cue, no signal, the water column at the center rippled once, then stilled. The glow beneath the floor softened, dimmed, and finally faded. No one spoke. They simply turned and walked the spiral outward, each on their own time, at their own rhythm. Outside the chamber, the reef city exhaled. The storm's presence lingered, but its voice had quieted. The pressure lifted, and in its place the kind of silence that does not ask to be filled. Tiyanna and Thalen walked back toward home, slower now. "I remember this feeling," he said. She looked over, her voice barely above a whisper. Not a feeling, a return. Part 22. The Shape of Stillness. The walk home from the chamber of resting tone was different than their morning walk to the garden. There was no conversation, no reason to speak. The storm's pressure had lifted, but its echo still resonated beneath the skin. The very air of Naraan'ta had changed, lighter now, but layered with memory. Even the city's systems moved more slowly. The ambient tones between corridors stretched into longer intervals, like breath held before release. Tiyanna opened the door to her dwelling with her hand already in motion before the panel. It felt almost unnecessary, as though the walls themselves had expected their return. Inside, the warmth was subtle. The dwelling had adjusted its tone to match the post-storm atmosphere. Lighting shifted to cool gold and low rose. Temperature softened. Diffuser flame held steady. A familiar scent greeted them, the slow burn blend of tide petal and dusk stone, chosen automatically by the home's pattern reading systems. They removed their robes and folded them neatly, hanging them over the driftwood perch beside the entry. Then, without decision, they each began tending to small tasks. Thalen moved to the supply shelf and began checking the water stones, flat, porous discs that kept mineral content balanced in the bathing pool. He inspected each one gently, brushing sediment from their grooves with a soft, bristled tool. Tiyanna refilled the herb vessels in the nourishment corner, grinding new stalks of sea lavender and steep root into their individual compartments. The sound of her pestle turning was quiet and rhythmic, a perfect counterpoint to the low hum of the diffuser. They worked like this for some time. No purpose beyond continuity, no urgency. The tasks themselves weren't necessary in that moment, but they were meaningful. Each motion was a way of marking time, not in hours or steps, but in care, in the tactile reminder that a world attended is a world inhabited fully. Eventually, Tiyanna lit the reflection lamp, a shallow bowl of polished glass filled with translucent oil and a floating wick. Its flame was small but steady, casting long arcs of light on the wall above the resting alcove. She placed 2 listening shells beside it. Thalen joined her. They sat on the low floor cushions, cross-legged, knees touching the edges of the glow. Each lifted a shell to their ear, not to speak, but to listen. The shells, collected from the outer reef cycles ago, carried tiny chambers that caught and echoed the sounds of breath and motion within the room. They offered no music, only presence. For a while they listened. To breath, to silence, to the low vibration of their own pulse passing through the curved bone of the shell. Tiyanna eventually lowered hers and placed it gently back on the mat. "I used to think storms cleared things away," she said. Thailand did not respond immediately. Then, "Maybe they just let you notice what was already waiting." She looked over, eyes soft. "Or what you had forgotten to tend." He gave a slow nod, then reached for the herb kettle. She did not stop him. He boiled water slowly, steeped a light brew of soft stem blossom and curled moss rind. The aroma that filled the room was warm and settling. They sipped together without comment, hands wrapped around the cups. When the tea was finished, Tiyanna stood and crossed to her garden window. The reef outside was in motion again, currents flowing cleanly, fish returning to their soft spirals. The storm's presence had passed entirely now, but it had left something behind. A deeper quiet, not of absence, but of attention. She touched the window lightly with her fingertips. Inside, the home was lit by one lamp, one diffuser, and the shared presence of two Abbai in a world shaped not by events, but by how one moves through them. And that was enough. Part 23. The Unspoken Story. The day's final tones passed gently through the reef city, like the slow drawing closed of a curtain. Tiyanna and Thalin sat once more beside the western window, now dim with twilight. Outside, the current had quieted again. Faint trails of light passed through the upper water. Phosphorescent plankton stirred by the shift from warmth to cool. Far off, a pair of broad-finned gliders drifted past the dome in synchronized arcs, their bellies glowing softly in the gloom. Inside, the only light came from the reflection lamp, now reduced to a flickering ember at the base of its glass bowl. Its glow traced long, fluid shadows on the floor, flickers of memory with no form. Neither had spoken for some time. Not out of reluctance, simply because nothing had asked to be said. Eventually, Thalin shifted slightly on the cushion. "Do you still keep stories?" Tiyanna glanced toward the low shelf along her eastern wall, lined with scrolls, etched shells, two closed memory boxes. "I never stopped." He reached over and tapped one of the small reed-wrapped scrolls with his finger. "That one. I remember that one." She handed it to him without hesitation. Unrolled, it bore a single column of words, written in ink made from nocturne sap and bluestone powder. The script was graceful but informal, a recording of a spoken tale, a short one. There was once a wave that did not wish to return. The shore waited, then sang, and the wave, remembering, came home. Thalin read it once, then again. Then, slowly, he re-rolled it and placed it back on the shelf. He did not speak. Instead, he stood and crossed to the bathing alcove, where he poured warm water over his hands in the stone basin, one of the rituals observed before rest sharing, an old Abbai practice for pairs who had shared a day of labor or reflection. Tiyanna followed, doing the same. They did not need to discuss whether they would sleep in proximity. The question had already been answered in silence. The guest mat remained prepared, but tonight they unfolded the twin rest mat, a single, wider cushion layered with soft thermal weave, traditionally used for companions bound by memory or practice. No words of parting were spoken. Tiyanna extinguished the reflection lamp. Thalen adjusted the room's night resonance setting, choosing the setting marked tide below moon. A slow, rolling rhythm of tone and pulse designed to ease the breath into sleep. They each lay back, on opposite sides of the mat, hands folded lightly on their own chests. Above them, the diffuser light dimmed to the faintest hue, barely more than the color of deep breath. Tiyanna whispered the traditional phrase for closing a shared day. "The sea holds us both. Let it keep what we do not." Thalen echoed, more breath than sound. "And may it return only what we still need." There was no movement after that, only breath and the soft, receding rhythm of the sea outside. Sleep came not as an end, but as a return, a wave reaching the shore, a story completing its shape in silence. Part 24. The Gentle Departure. Morning rose in its familiar way, first with breath, then with light. Tiyanna opened her eyes slowly, feeling the shift in the air before she fully awoke. The diffuser lamp had begun its low, silvery glow. The scent was subtle, dawnroot and light shellbark, chosen by the dwelling's memory to soothe and focus. She exhaled softly, her hand resting against the fabric of the shared mat. Beside her, Thalen was already sitting upright. His hands were folded loosely in his lap. He was not preparing to speak, nor rushing to rise. He simply sat, breathing in rhythm with the slow pulse of the city's morning tones. Tiyanna joined him in sitting. They did not greet each other with words. Their eyes met, and that was enough. After a time, he stood and moved to the cleansing alcove, rinsing his face and hands with warm water. Tiyanna remained still, her thoughts suspended in that fragile space between waking and doing. She reached for a soft wrap and pulled it around her shoulders, then moved to the nourishment corner. She prepared sea marrow broth, enriched with bloom vine petal and dusted with curled salt leaf. It was a parting meal, not ceremonial, but grounding, a way of sealing the moment into the body. Thalen returned and helped slice sunfruit rounds and lay them on a dish of pressed stone lily leaves. Their hands moved without instruction, the way they always had when preparing a task together. They sat at the window table, the reef now bathed in early gold light. Outside, the water was calm again, the fish gliding with soft, symmetrical ease. Small seed creatures stirred in the sand near the dome's edge, early risers digging and unfurling. The meal was eaten in silence. Each bite was shared memory. Each sip a form of thank you neither needed to say aloud. When they had finished, Thalen stood and gathered his wrap from the wall. He tied it across his shoulders in the old way, practical, travel-ready, with the clasp centered over his chest. "I'll follow the mid-current east," he said softly. Tiyanna nodded. "You'll reach the warm shelf by evening." He glanced down at the floor, then out at the reef. "I left because I didn't know how to stay still." "And now?" He smiled. "I still don't. But I know where the stillness lives." He turned toward the door, then paused. From the memory shelf, Tiyanna retrieved a small circular token, etched stone, polished smooth, with a single spiral carved into the center. No name, no mark of ownership. She placed it in his hand. He didn't ask what it meant. He closed his fingers around it and bowed his head. At the threshold, he placed one palm on the entry crest, turned back once more, and gave her the quiet Abbai farewell. Not a wave, but a subtle shift of weight from one foot to the other, as if readying for the next step while still remembering the last. Then he was gone. Tiyanna stood by the doorway until the soft click of the corridor faded. Only then did she return inside. She did not feel emptiness. Instead, she felt the shape of absence, like the echo of a dropped stone still traveling outward through water. Not loss, but resonance. She folded the twin mat away, smoothed the linens, and returned the diffuser to its usual rhythm. Then she stepped to the window. Outside, the reef was as it had always been, but within her, something had stilled more deeply. She breathed once, then again. And then, as she had so many mornings before, she turned toward the garden stairs, her robe light against her shoulders, her feet bare on the cool floor. Part 25. As before, not the same. The walk to the garden felt familiar again, but not in the way a circle closes. Tiyanna moved along the curve of the reef walk, her robe fluttering gently around her ankles. The tiles beneath her feet were warm with the breath of the city's morning heat cycle. Overhead, the filtered dome light shimmered in long gold-blue rays, the upper ocean clear again, lit from above like soft glass. As she descended the coral stone stair, she passed the memory etchings as she always had. But today, her fingers lingered just a breath longer on the carved line that read, "We do not step into the same sea. We do not step out unchanged." The garden greeted her with movement. Whisperleaf rows bent gently as if in welcome. The root fans had shifted overnight, one row curling slightly in upon itself, responding to a temperature shift in the lower dome. The light vines along the western wall had bloomed unexpectedly, their pale flowers opening with a faint shimmer along their edges. Tiyanna knelt beside the vine bed and gently turned a leaf, inspecting its underside. No rot, no trace of mineral stress, just new growth, unexpected, unplanned, entirely welcome. She worked without hurry. Each motion restored a small point of balance, repositioning the nutrient braid that fed the bloom cluster, loosening the soil ring around the newest star root stalks, and gently dusting the sediment from the low-lying frond tips near the corner pool. There was no need to rush, no need to finish. The garden was not a task. It was a place of continuity, a companion that grew quietly beside her. After tending the water feeder, she returned to the central stone and sat cross-legged, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The reef above the dome swirled in soft, slow spirals. A flock of ribbon gliders passed overhead, their long tails trailing behind them like forgotten thoughts. Her eyes half closed, she listened. Not to sound, but to stillness. It was different now. Not louder, not quieter. Simply more known. Thalen had come and gone like a tide, but what he stirred remained, in the rhythms of breath, in the garden's small surprises, in the way the home seemed to hold a deeper echo of being shared. And yet, she did not feel drawn away from herself, only rooted more fully. She placed her hand on the warm stone beneath her. "You remain," she whispered. It was unclear whether she was speaking to the garden, the city, or herself. perhaps all three. She remained there until the dome light began its slow shift to midday, and the tones in the corridor signaled the change of cycle. Then she rose, dusted her hands, and climbed the spiral stairs once more. Above, the tea leaves would be ready. The scrolls would wait. The day would unfold as it always had, and as it now would. Part 26. The Spiral Shared. The archive chamber held a different stillness today. Not emptier, not quieter, simply more settled. Tiyanna arrived before midday, walking the long spiral corridor past the etched memory panels, her hand tracing the symbols out of habit. When she reached her alcove, she found the cushions already laid out, the tools of instruction prepared. Kelsari had arrived early. The young apprentice sat with her back straight, a scroll open before her, hands folded neatly in her lap. But her eyes were not on the text. They stared softly toward the far wall, where shadows moved gently in the filtered light. "You arrived early," Tiyanna said. Kelsari blinked. It felt like a day to listen longer. Tiyanna offered no correction. She took her place opposite, seating herself with care. Then today's lesson should match. From the nearby shelf, she retrieved 2 harmony discs, thin, round slabs of polished stone etched with spirals. When turned, they emitted a soft hum, barely audible but resonant enough to guide breath and voice. She placed one before Kelsari. The other remained in her palm. "Today we won't speak much," she said. Kelsari's head tilted. "But what will we study?" Tiyanna offered her a small smile. "Change." The girl said nothing, but lowered her gaze to the disc. Tiyanna began to turn hers, slowly, rhythmically. A hum emerged, soft as sleep, held for 6 slow breaths before fading. Then Kelsari followed, her hands uncertain at first, but steadier with each rotation. Together, they traded silence through tone. Time slipped away, measured only by the rise and fall of quiet resonance. After several cycles, Tiyanna reached into her robe and withdrew a single scroll fragment, a torn portion of an old text. Its edges were worn, and the ink had faded in parts. She passed it across the table. Kelsari unrolled it slowly. The fragment read, "It was not the sea that changed. It was the way I held it." She looked up, unsure. "This isn't a full verse." "No," Tiyanna replied. "It never was." "Then, how do I complete it?" Tiyanna turned her harmony disc once more. Its tone shimmered in the air between them. Then, softly, "You don't. You only let it echo." Kelsari stared at the scroll for a long moment, then closed her eyes. She let the tone settle in her chest. Her breath slowed. Her fingers relaxed. The scroll remained before her, unfinished, but no longer incomplete. After a time, she looked across the table. "Did someone give this to you?" Tiyanna did not answer immediately. Then she reached across and touched the edge of the scroll with 2 fingers. Gently, reverently. "Yes," she said, and then they left. Kelsari bowed her head, but not in grief, in understanding. The lesson ended not with words, but with the placing of the scroll back into the listening box, where fragments and echoes were stored for others to find, not to finish, but to feel. As they parted, Kelsari paused at the door. She turned back once, her voice quiet. "I'll be early again tomorrow." Tiyanna gave a small nod. Then I will prepare nothing, so we can discover everything. And with that, the young apprentice left, carrying no answers but much presence. Tiyanna remained, her fingers lightly pressed to the scroll box. The sea had not changed, but something in the way she held it had. Part 27. Along the Outer Dome. The city had taken on the amber tone of mid-afternoon by the time Tiyanna wrapped her light shawl around her shoulders and stepped through the dwelling's drift curtain. The dome's filtered light shimmered gently against her robe, pale green against pale gray. She moved without aim, though not without rhythm. The path to the outer dome walk curved in wide arcs, following the contours of Naraan'ta's western edge. Here, the reef met the city's outermost rings. Market stalls, learning alcoves, rest gardens, and suspended walkways arched above the shallower coral beds. The light in this dome had a different hue. Brighter, tinged with gold, softened by its longer path through the ocean above. She passed a driftwood stall where an elder named Venari sold hollow-carved wind shells. The shells hummed when strung, tuned by shape and time. One hung from a thin reed hook, spinning lazily. It sang a note that drifted slightly downward, as though remembering something it had never said aloud. Venari gave her a slow, knowing nod. "I remember your cousin," she said softly. Tiyanna smiled without stopping. He remembered this place, too. Further along, a group of children played in a circle garden. They ran in spirals, chasing the rippling projections of reef creatures dancing across the walkway. A simulation fed by ambient light and shaped by their movement. One child, perhaps 6 or 7 cycles old, paused as Tiyanna approached. She wore a headband of curling vine threads and held a stone feather, a symbol often placed on quiet altars. She held it out. For the sea. Tiyanna knelt, touched the child's forehead gently. "And for your feet, to follow its shape." The child beamed and darted back into the game, her laughter blending with the soft chime of water passing through the upper ducts. Tiyanna moved on. She stopped briefly at a tea stall where an apprentice keeper offered her a taste of a new brew. Steeped from high-current blossom, harvested between storms. The flavor was airy and sweet, with a bitter finish that faded slowly. "It tastes like a question," she said. The apprentice bowed deeply, delighted. A nearby mural caught her eye, one she had walked past countless times but now saw anew. Painted in water dyes that shimmered subtly with light, it depicted the founding of Naraan'ta, broad domes rising from open coral, Abbai elders with open arms, a great spiral etched into the seabed. A gesture of gathering, of coming together without conquest. She stood before it for a long time, not to study, but to absorb, to be part of the rhythm it remembered. As she continued her walk, the outer dome hummed softly beneath her feet. The currents here flowed gently past the structure, making the sea itself feel close, just on the other side of the glass, waiting, watching, moving as it always had. And yet everything was alive with subtle change. Vendors adjusted their wares. Elders passed quietly between stalls. Children chased the echoes of movement. And she, who had walked these domes so many times before, felt as though she were meeting them anew. Not because the city had changed, but because she had, slightly, quietly, unmistakably. She turned back toward the heart of Naraan'ta just as the city's tones shifted again, announcing the late cycle. Shadows began to lengthen. The reef beyond the dome softened into layers of light and blue, and with that, Tiyanna returned to her center, one step at a time, walking not forward or back, but deeper. Part 28. The Stone and the Thread. By the time Tiyanna returned to the inner dome, the light had shifted into its evening phase, a soft mixture of plum and gold that danced along the upper arches of the city's coral structures. The reef outside had quieted again, fish moving slower now, shadows longer and more fluid. She stepped through her dwelling's curtain with the gentle weight of a day well lived. The interior welcomed her with low amber light and a scent chosen by memory: drift petal and seed rind. The diffuser hummed faintly. Her robe hung neatly on its perch. The cushion by the window still held the curve of her earlier sitting. Everything was as she had left it. And yet, on the low center table, where she often placed her tea or open scrolls, sat something new. Small, unassuming, but new. Tiyanna moved toward it and knelt. It was a stone, smooth and palm-sized. Not uncommon in color, gray with a faint green vein threading its center. But what set it apart was the way it had been etched. A spiral, precise and deep, wrapped around the stone's center like a tide wound upon itself. And tucked beneath it, folded with care, a thin strip of woven sea thread. A single line of familiar script ran across its surface, not as a goodbye, only a circle. Her fingers curled gently around the stone. The spiral was unmistakable. Thalin's mark. She hadn't seen him leave it. He'd made no mention. But that, too, was his way. Not a gesture meant to change anything, only to honor what was already unfolding. She did not cry, nor did she smile. She simply sat with it for a time, the stone resting in her palm, the message still vibrating softly in her chest. Eventually, she rose and crossed to her memory shelf, where small tokens from other moments lived. A scroll from her mentor, a shard of her mother's wind shell, a dried blossom from her first harvest. She placed the stone there, not in the center, but slightly off to the side. It would not anchor her, it would accompany her. She returned to the window seat as the reef dimmed into deeper blues. Outside, plankton drifted like stars. Inside, her breath slowed, deepened. Not a goodbye, only a circle. She repeated the words once, then let them drift out of thought and into presence, where they would remain, not held, but known. Part 29. The Sea Without Shore. The home had fully entered its night phase. The walls now breathed faint warmth, a quiet sigh with each cycle of the temperature regulators. Light dimmed to the lowest tone, deep lavender threaded with gray. Outside, the reef was a silhouette, lit only by the scatter of bioluminescence and the faint reflection of the dome's protective filters. Tiyanna moved slowly, with no plan. There was no need. Her body knew what remained. She gathered her tea bowl from the nourishment corner, rinsed and dried already, but she held it for a moment, weighing it in her hands. Its shape was uneven, intentional, made long ago when she first learned that imperfection creates a place for breath to settle. She set it on the window ledge. Then she walked to the cleansing alcove, where warm water waited in the shallow basin. gently warmed by the same silent system that had always known when to prepare it. She submerged her hands, then her forearms, her face, each motion deliberate, unhurried, not washing away the day, inviting it to rest. Once dry, she returned to her resting alcove, where her mat had already begun its soft transformation, edges curling upward slightly, center hollowing to meet the curve of her back. A cradle, not a platform. She selected no dream token tonight. The message left on her table, the stone and the thread, still echoed in her breath, and that was enough. Instead, she lit the night flame, a small flicker in a shell-shaped cup beside her pillow. It would burn only an hour, releasing a soft resin scent that had no name but was meant to soothe the unseen mind. Cool, woody, and just slightly sweet. She lay down. Her head sank into the mat's pillow, warm from ambient heat. The wrap of her robe settled around her ankles. One hand rested lightly on her abdomen. The other curled gently near her shoulder, fingers open to the room. She let her breath guide her down. Inhale, 4 counts. Hold, 3. Exhale, 6. Rest, 2. Repeat. The flame danced once more, then steadied. No thoughts came. Only shapes. The spiral of the carved stone, the ripple of laughter from a child in the dome, the slow vibration of a storm heard not in sound, but in the bones. The weight of presence without burden. The sea moved beyond the dome, unseen, and within it she drifted. Sleep arrived not as a shift or break, but as the moment when water becomes depth, when light is no longer needed to know where you are. Tiyanna exhaled once more, and the world exhaled with her. Part 30. As the Tide Returns. The first light of the new cycle arrived in silence. It pressed gently through the upper dome, filtered through the ocean above, softened by the memory of darkness. The reef beyond the glass shimmered in the palest blue, as though the sea itself were still dreaming. Inside the dwelling, the diffuser lamp shifted. Its light became pearled, its breath longer. The air held the faintest scent of tide petal and new-sliced kelp bark. Clean, crisp, and opening. Tiyanna's eyes fluttered open. Her body stirred as it always did, first with breath, then with motion. She lay still for several minutes, the mat beneath her adjusting as she shifted slowly from one side to her back. She was not in a hurry. No day in Naraan'ta ever demanded to be chased. She sat up. The shell flame had burned out some hours before, its bowl now faintly warm to the touch. She picked it up, held it for a moment, then placed it on the corner of her rest shelf. Another cycle completed. She stood, stretched, and moved to the basin. The water was cool again, unheated for morning intentionally. The splash on her cheeks awakened her skin, the back of her neck, the tips of her fingers. A soft intake of breath followed. The first sound she made. The first words, spoken into the stillness of her home, came in the form of an old phrase. Stillness behind me. Stillness ahead. I walk the middle tide. She dressed in a simple robe of blue-green, clasped with a pearl thread pin. No need for ceremony, only presence. The nourishment corner offered a soft grain porridge and the last slice of sunfruit from the week's preparation. She took both, eating while seated on the window cushion. The sea beyond the dome was lightening. The schools of windfish were already forming their morning spirals. The glider pods passed higher near the surface where the sunlight was beginning to pierce the upper current. Her eyes softened at the sight. It was not new, and that was its beauty. She tidied the dishes, wiped the table, reset the scroll mat near the teaching alcove, where she would meet Kelsari again before midday. Then, slowly, she approached the memory shelf. She paused, fingertips grazing the spiral stone Thalin had left behind. It was still there, just off-center, just where it belonged. She did not pick it up. She only acknowledged it with the quiet gravity of someone who understands that nothing truly important ever needs to be touched twice. She closed her eyes. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Rest. Then she turned toward the door. The day ahead was neither empty nor full. It simply was. And she would meet it, as she always had. Gently, completely, and in time with the still waters that shaped her. As the door opened and the first breath of reef-scented air entered the home, Tiyanna stepped forward. The spiral continued. You've now traveled through the still waters of Naraan'ta. The currents have passed. The reef has quieted. The day has folded gently into night. Let the calm of Tiyanna's world stay with you. In your breath, in your body, in the soft rhythm beneath your thoughts. There is nothing more to do. No need to remember where you've been. No need to wonder what comes next. Just let yourself drift now, held by stillness, carried by sleep. The sea is quiet, and so are you.